Welcome to a session called Political Common Sense. I hope you're interested in that, in 4 easy steps. I'm Betsy Cantwell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Arizona. If you haven't noticed, Americans are increasingly polarized by virtually every measure, except on the issues themselves. So we are evenly divided with nearly a 50-50 split in the houses of Congress. And to some of us, it looks like an unbreakable deadlock. But the more than 50,000 members of the Commonsense American program, which you will be hearing about, have drawn on these 2 factors to dramatically improve bipartisan congressional problem solving. So I would like to introduce Keith Allred to you, and Keith will talk to you about how to defeat the odds in this increasingly polarized world that we live in and bring common sense back to American politics. Keith is the executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. This organization is part of the University of Arizona, based in Washington, D.C., and actively works to build our nation's capacity to engage in differences constructively. And I think what you'll hear from Keith is what's the plan, more than just talking. Keith launched Commonsense American in 2017, which is a program that actively brings Republicans, Democrats, and independents together from across the country. As I said, they have over 50,000 members now to find and champion solutions that have broad grassroots support across all measures. I will add, so that you do the following, that in 2017, Keith finished 8th in the world standings for cutting horse competition, and is therefore, because we're in Texas, wearing his buckle. And that buckle, I just want you to know, was totally earned. So please welcome Keith Allred.
Thank you, Betsy. It is great to be with all of you today here at South by Southwest and in the University of Arizona's Wonder House. It's a really magnificent stage we've got to take on this tough topic of politics in the United States today. It's a real honor for me to lead the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona, in part because it has such a compelling origin story, so I want to share that with you. The University of Arizona established NICD in the wake of the Tucson shooting in 2011 that killed 6 and injured another 13, including Representative Gabby Giffords, who was holding a Congress on Your Corner event. A lot of people have heard about the Tucson shooting, but there's a part of that story that a lot of people don't know, and that is just several weeks prior to the Tucson shooting, Gabby approached the University of Arizona and described her increasing concerns with the declining civility and lack of bipartisanship in the United States Congress. And she was suggesting that the university establish a center or an institute to do something about it. So when the Tucson shooting happened just several weeks later, the university was committed to following through on that vision. And that was such a tragic, galvanizing experience. It gave the university real convening power. So we have one of the most impressive groups of bipartisan leaders in the country who joined to establish this and get this institute going. So our founding co-chairs were Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and also on the board, just among the most impressive bipartisan group of leaders in the country, standing up for the proposition that we should engage our differences more constructively. So we've been at this for 11 years, one of the earliest groups to kind of take on the polarization problem, and so we repeatedly show up in the national press and get quoted about the kind of work that we're doing. So we're going to talk, as Betsy indicated, about how do we get to a better place in our politics. Before I share with you that work that we're doing, I want to just have a little bit of a discussion with you and get your sense of how are you feeling about American politics today? What are you most discouraged by? And are there any points of light for you? Any points of hope or encouragement? So what are people thinking and feeling about our politics today? Yeah.
So I'm very discouraged by what seems to be a lot of echo chambers where lots of groups are talking to themselves,
right,
and the messages are getting stronger and stronger, and people are becoming more isolated and polarized. So how do we get people to cross those lines?
Yeah, how do we get outside of those information bubbles and those echo chambers where we're just talking to each other, getting more extreme as we kind of whip each other up and then don't engage across those differences, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, along the same line, some people may be doing that because they feel like when they want to have an intellectual conversation about a really tough subject, we're often alienating each other very quickly instead of having that intelligent conversation about a topic to find a solution.
It feels a little hard to have intelligent conversation about solutions, doesn't it? Yeah, right here.
I find it very difficult when everybody's a victim. And the victimization and therefore they're being persecuted and the person is their enemy, not their rival,
right,
not having a different opinion.
Right.
So this idea that everyone is a victim of someone else or some evil,
right,
this is what's, I think, driving a lot of the issues.
right. And I think something that goes with that sense of victimization, and most people do, wherever you are on the political spectrum, you're sort of feeling victimized by the folks on the other end, right? And part of the problem, I think, with that victimization mindset is it's a little bit of a gripe and complain rather than what are we going to do about it? What are the solutions? And it's very hard in a country of over 300 million people teeming with diversity to get to any solutions unless we can kind of come together. It's very hard for any one group to impose their will on everybody else. And so we've got to be able to get across that kind of raw sense of victimization to say, well, what are we going to do about it? What's the solution? Yeah, back here.
I was just going to say, I think it encourages a lot of black and white thinking, and so you kind of have to pick a side and be in one zone when you may not agree with the entirety of what's on your side, but you agree with both, and just kind of figuring out, okay, this is the good idea, but what's the practical thing that we can do in our society?
Yeah. Any of you feel what she's saying, that you might lean this direction or that direction, but you just don't feel like you're going to buy it all wholesale, what this side or that side is saying? Anybody feeling like that, right? You might be a little surprised, but that's the majority of the country feels that way. But it feels like the only options we have is like, are you with us or against us? And if you're with us, you got to be with us on everything, right? And so the kind of problem-solving thinking, like you're saying, gets hard to do because a lot of solutions just don't have that simple of answers like that, right? Yeah, excellent point. Good. Well, much of the research really confirms, I think, what you and all of us are feeling. There's this kind of sinking feeling we get in our stomach that something is gone amiss in our politics today, that there's something, we know politics have always been kind of nasty, but it feels like something has gotten worse. Now, I know that for me, whenever I think about things that seem like they were better in the good old days, if you look at the research, it turns out they weren't that much better. Unfortunately, on this question of how bitterly we're divided in the country, the research suggests it's probably, in most regards, even worse than you think, with two important exceptions. So I want to dive into that research with you a little bit. And it, again, for not just the complaining and identifying the problem, but for get some insights into what can we do about it? How can we get to a better place? So if we start with the American Congress and look at what we know from research on this, two political scientists have invented this ingenious way of analyzing the more than 14 million roll call votes that have been cast since 1789. So they take, a given roll call vote, say in the United States Senate, and you say, okay, how did Elizabeth Warren vote on that particular issue? Who voted with her and who voted on the other side of it? And then you look at they computed the dimension mathematically that best accounts for the pattern of voting across every roll call vote ever in Congress. So that dimension goes from a -9, or -1 really, to a +1, and you can score every senator and every representative somewhere along that dimension, and you can do it going all the way back to 1789. So this is what the United States Senate looks like today, and you'll see that Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, scores the furthest to the left on the scale. Over on the far right, you have Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul in a tough competition for the furthest to the right. And then in the middle for the Democrats, the closest to the middle is Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and furthest to the middle from the Republicans is Senator Susan Collins from Maine. Now, you can take the average score then, these are called nominate scores, for each party and compute what that average is, and then look at the distance between the two parties to measure how far apart are they. So we call that the polarization index. And we can do that for every Congress. We're now on the 118th Congress, and we can go all the way back. So this is what the Senate looks like today. And if we go back 40 plus years to 1977, 1978, here's what it looked like. So you see that polarization index is quite a bit lower. We've had a 37% increase since then to today. So the two sides were closer to each other. In fact, you see here, there's overlap. Nearly 1/5 of the Senate was in that overlap space, whereas today, there is a gap in between an overall much wider difference. So that's the evidence we have on Congress and where that comes from. And we can then map that polarization index across the entirety of our history. So if you do that, here's what this looks like. This 37% increase starting in 1977, and I'll just put a few markers on here so you can see where this is. And a couple of things to note then here. One is that in 2015, 2016, we broke the record that had stood for 205 years, so that we are now quantifiably the most polarized in Congress that we have ever been. But I don't think that's the most distressing part of this. The more distressing part is that it is a singular period in American history where we have more than 40 years of accelerating polarization. We've never had that before. In general, when polarization has come up, it has spiked and then come down pretty quickly. But this is the longest trend line, and it's an accelerating trend line. So the polarization continues to increase. So it suggests that something deeper and more fundamental, more systemic is going on in our politics today. And there's a lot that goes into that. I won't go into all of the why did it start then and what are the basic causes of it. But the most important piece of it is that starting in the 1970s, for the first time in American history, the two parties started to sort themselves out ideologically. For a set of odd historical reasons throughout our history prior to that, we had always had parties that had a mix of liberals, moderates, and conservatives in both parties. For many of us, we can recall the time when the conservative Southern Democrats and liberal Northern Republicans were quite common, and that's when we had that overlap going on. But that's true of almost the entirety of American history until the late 1970s, and so there are virtually no conservatives left in the Democratic Party and fewer moderates, virtually no liberals left in the Republican Party and fewer moderates. And so that's been essentially what kicked all this off, and then there's a lot of second and third order effects. So that's what it looks like if we're just looking at the Congress. But our polarization has become so deep and pitched and multifaceted today that political scientists have had to draw additional distinctions to adequately describe what's going on in our period. So I want to walk you through a couple of those. The first distinction they draw is between issues and social polarization. So issues polarization is what we typically think of as how far apart is the everyday Democrat, the average Democrat, and the average Republican on concrete, specific issues, policy issues of the day. The second kind of polarization that they now is the new piece that we have to introduce is social polarization, or sometimes called affective polarization. And this is just how angry are we across that partisan divide? How much are we kind of shaking our finger and feel this real animosity towards the other side? So that's become, since about the 1990s, a very important distinction to draw about, well, which are you talking about when you talk about polarization? Then it turns out to also be important to distinguish, okay, who are we talking about? Who's polarized? So we started off talking about political leaders, particularly the Congress, but then of course, this is a government by the people. Where are we as a people? And here it's important to distinguish also between the politically active and everyday citizens. And depending on how you define it, the politically active are typically kind of 10 to 20% of the population that really is deeply engaged in politics. And then there's the 80 to 90% of the rest of us who might have some involvement but don't eat, breathe, and sleep politics. So if we draw all those distinctions and then we look at the research of, well, just how polarized are we and how does that compare with earlier periods in American history, here's the pattern that we see. And that is that every single type of polarization that we can measure is at the highest level ever recorded and rising, and typically rising pretty rapidly, with one really critical exception, and that is everyday Americans on issues. We are far less polarized on the issues than we think we are. In fact, the research documents that we are half as far apart on the issues as we typically think about. That's only everyday Americans. That's not the politically active. That's not our political leaders. And in spite of agreeing on a lot, we are more angry at each other than ever. So the social polarization goes up even though the issues polarization isn't. And of course, part of the reason is we don't know how much we agree on. We have been fed a narrative by political leaders and by the media that we are much more polarized, and that serves their particular aims, and they are fomenting that to a large degree, and so giving us the misperception that we really don't agree on much when that, in fact, is not the case. So that particular finding there suggested to us at NICD a way of trying to do something about it. There's one other important thing to understand about polarization today, and that is, although we are more deeply divided by most measures than ever, we're in a period where we are more evenly divided than almost ever before in American history. Today, the United States Senate is 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. Has been for a number of years now. In the House, the margins of both the Democrats and the Republicans, when they've controlled it, has been by about 5 or 10 votes. Extremely narrow. A level of parity that we have almost never seen, and certainly not for the extended time. This has been true for about 20 or 30 years in American politics. Now, there's a lot of difficult things about that, but one of the points of light for us at NICD was the implication of that is that although we have fewer moderates, fewer people in the middle, it doesn't take very many of them in an evenly divided Congress to give you what you need to pass some common sense solutions. So drawing on these two insights then, we're not satisfied at NICD just to study and document the problem. We really want to do something about it. We're serious about moving that needle, but we try to be informed by the rigorous research on that. And so the conclusion that we drew in that deep study of the research was that we should first engage everyday Americans particularly on issues, because the research suggests it'd be much easier to find solutions that could attract support across our partisan divide than it appears to be the case. And then if we could identify those kinds of solutions among everyday citizens, let's engage Congress with those results, and particularly to engage those moderates who in an evenly divided Congress could have outsized influence. And that the combination of those two things, if we could do it well, might be remarkably successful. So this is the work that we undertook when we launched Commonsense American, and I am delighted to tell you that we have had some stunning success. Now, the measure of success here is, what we set out for ourselves is, can we increase the probability that solutions wise enough to attract broad grassroots support can pass the United States Congress? Now, if you come up with an idea where the primary metric of success is literally passing an act of Congress, you should probably get a different idea, right? I mean, we talk about passing an act of Congress as like the definition of doing something very difficult. But I'm happy to report that we are now 3 for 3 in the American Congress. We've taken on 3 issues, and on all 3, we have succeeded in passing legislation. First, in 2020, we were key to ending surprise medical billing. In 2021, we were part of the team that led to the historic investments in physical infrastructure in our nation. And just several months ago, at the end of 2022, we were a critical part of the team updating the Electoral Count Act, which is the law that governs how we count the results of the presidential election in Congress that led to such chaos on January 6th in 2023. So that's the work that we've undertaken, and the key to it all has been that we have been able to mobilize more than 53,000 Americans. More than 53,000 Americans in just the last 4 years have joined this effort to bring common sense to Washington. Now, we are attracting members at about 3.5 times the speed and about 15% the cost that we anticipated we would. It's about the only thing I've ever done in my life that has gone faster and been cheaper than I expected it to be. And I think that's because we have struck a really resonant chord among the American people, that they really are hungry for a different kind of politics where we can engage constructively and be practically focused on solutions. It's also a politically balanced group, and we recruit in ways to make sure that we keep it balanced. We're in all 50 states with over 100 members. By the way, Texas has the most members of Commonsense American of any state, outdoes California or Florida. So we're pretty fond of Texas at Commonsense American. So I want to walk you through the 4 steps we take with these 53,000 Americans to rack up that track record of success in this highly polarized Congress. How do you pull that off, that you can actually pass common sense solutions? So the first of the 4 steps is that we identify 1 issue per year to work on, and it's the members that pick the issue, and we have a whole process, but we're looking for issues that have the best combination of being meaningful. If we could pass some solutions in this area, it would make a real difference in everyday Americans' lives, but is also achievable. And that is that there's enough interest on a bipartisan way among Republicans and Democrats in the Congress that you could imagine actually getting something done in this Congress. So once we pick that issue, then we move to the second step, and we as a staff then develop thorough policy briefs on that issue. The key to these policy briefs is we provide good information on it, but the central part is that we articulate the strongest case for and against each policy proposal. So we're not trying to tell the American people what the right idea, what the right solution is. We're trying to give them enough information to form their own judgment about that. When we finish the brief, then our members in the third step have committed to spending an hour or more per year weighing in on each of the proposals that was in the brief. So every proposal that we describe, they indicate whether they support or oppose that proposal. And then fourth, we take the results from thousands of Americans doing this and engage Congress with them, particularly those members of Congress in the center, but we engage quite broadly. We'll typically do 50 to 100 congressional briefings per year on the issue that we pick. And that's the process by which we have racked up this set of successes. So I want to walk you through one example of this, our most recent one, the work in 2022 on the Electoral Count Act. So this is the brief that our members reviewed, and so you can see that it gives background on the Electoral Count Act and how Congress is supposed to count the votes. And then we get to the specific proposals for how to update or reform the Electoral Count Act. So for example, we're going to clarify that after Election Day, the state legislature can't just make up new rules. And we describe what the proposal is, and then what's the strongest case for, and what's the strongest case against that proposal. So our members, we had over 5,000 members that responded on this, and then once they've all weighed in, then we engage Congress with the results. And here's what the results looked like on the Electoral Count Act. So there are various pieces, discrete pieces of how the Electoral Count Act was proposed to be changed. And one example was we should clarify that the vice president's role is simply ministerial. They're just there to preside over the process. They don't have any independent authority there. And we found that 88% of Americans agreed with that, with very little difference across the partisan divide. A very interesting part of the finding, though, was once we asked them, do you agree with doing this, said, what do you think the average Republican member or the average Democratic member of Commonsense American would think? If we can scroll just back up for a second, Chris, to that. And we found that both sides dramatically underestimated the amount of support the other side. It's like, well, yeah, I can see it's a good idea, but those yahoos over there can't. And it turns out they can. So we asked Republicans, what percentage of Democrats will support it? And they said, yeah, 67%. It turned out 98% do. And we asked Democrats, what percentage of Republican members of Commonsense American do you think would support it? They said, yeah, 41%. In fact, 80% of Republicans agreed with that. So you can see that kind of perception gap that we don't know just how much we agree. And you can see there were a bunch of other proposals there. Chris, we can scroll on up, and we won't go through all of those, but that'll give you a feel for how we engage Congress on this work. And I got to tell you, it's a very faith-restoring kind of experience to do this and to have that kind of success. It's faith-restoring to engage with these everyday Americans and sort of have a sense of, hey, we're not as crazed as it looks. It's also been faith-restoring to engage in Congress with this way, in this way, and see, just how many of them are, in fact, quite receptive to that influence, and are in fact now coming to us saying, boy, this work is so important, and they'll now try to advocate which issue they want us to pick for the coming year because they know we're quite effective. So I want to capture a little bit of that, the reaction in Congress, which may be the most surprising part of this to me of all. And so we recently had an online gathering of our membership, and we had 4 especially pivotal members, senators, weigh in and record a video for our members to say thanks and their take on how that work is going. So I want to take you through each of those videos, and I'll kind of introduce the senators as we go. So we're going to start with Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia. As you saw on the graphs, he is the most moderate Democrat in a 50-50 Senate, right? So that makes him especially important. We often refer to him, at least he was when Democrats controlled the Senate. Now it's probably shifted to Senator Susan Collins, but when that was the case and you had Democrats controlling the House and Democrats controlling the White House, we often referred to Senator Manchin as the second most powerful leader in America, right? Because he was just so pivotal. And in fact, he was one of the key senators who really was arguing that work on the Electoral Count Act, protecting peaceful transitions of power for generations to come, really was important, and we could play an especially pivotal role. So we went to quite great lengths, including calling the Hewlett Foundation, saying, you guys got to get them more money because they're doing such good work on this stuff, and persuaded us, for what we shared with our members, that our members agreed that this would be something that would be quite interesting and important to work on. So we'll let Senator Manchin talk to you about what he sees about the contribution that we're making.
Hello, I'm United States Senator Joe Manchin. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today, and I'm so glad to be able to join you virtually. The National Institute for Civil Discourse is a leading voice for responsible bipartisan policymaking in Congress, which has always been very important to me. As a country, we are facing inflation, increasing energy costs, massive federal debt, and so many other issues. The work of the NICD is more critical than ever. For the sake of the country we all love, we must commit to addressing the serious challenges facing our nation in a bipartisan, lasting way. And that's why I always reach across the aisle to find compromise that focus on the many issues we face, not the D or the R next to someone's name. We had numerous opportunities this past Congress to pass meaningful bipartisan legislation, including the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Postal Service reform, the CHIPS and Science Act, and most recently, historic reforms to outdated Electoral Count Act of 1887. The bipartisan ECA reforms came after over a year of thoughtful negotiations with lawmakers, along with a wide variety of election experts and legal scholars. And the legislation was absolutely critical to establish clear guidelines for our system of certifying electoral votes for president and vice president. I am proud to have supported all of these bills, and that together with my colleagues, we were able to get them across the finish line. I'm also truly grateful for the tireless efforts of NICD. There is no doubt that your voices contributed to passing these pieces of important, practical legislation. And I'm pleased Commonsense America is more than 50,000 members strong. I hope voters will continue to join the program and help steer our country towards meaningful, civil conversations around politics. Americans are tired of the bitter partisanship plaguing our country, and your organization is leading the fight to put country ahead of party. By working together, we can continue to find common sense, bipartisan solutions that lead to long-term success for all West Virginians and Americans. Thank you, and God bless you.
So Senator Manchin particularly focused on our work on the Electoral Count Act, and there's a piece of that I just want to share with you. You know, they had gotten to work on what those reforms should be. It was Senator Manchin and Senator Susan Collins that formed a group of 16 senators, a bipartisan group, pretty shortly after January 6th to say, man, we've got to have better rules and better clarity so we're not so prone to the kind of chaos that we had. And they had gotten pretty far down the road in working on, what should those reforms be that would make sense to both Republicans and Democrats. And then, we picked that issue to work on. Then we kind of got out ahead of them. We got our brief put together and our members weighing in before they had introduced the legislation. They were getting hung up on a few pieces, and it was into the summer. It was getting a little bit late to be able to get this passed. This was going to be a significant undertaking. And so we actually passed them up in a sense, and we came out with our results. We knew all of the major proposals under active consideration, and so that's what our brief was on, and we had results on it. Our results came out, and then they introduced the legislation, and Senator Sinema's staff, Democrat from Arizona, reached out and said, thanks for all your help shaping this legislation. So for the first time in our history, we were not only helping them pass ideas that they had already worked on, but we were helping to shape the legislation. It was Senator Susan Collins who really convened the group to start with, along with Senator Manchin, and she's also been awfully grateful for our work. So we're going to hear from Senator Susan Collins, Republican from Maine.
I appreciate this opportunity to thank the more than 50,000 members of Commonsense American. Your commitment to bipartisanship is forging solutions to the challenges our nation faces. Your effective advocacy for the Electoral Count Reform Act was instrumental to its passage. This law will help to secure peaceful transitions of power for many years to come, and that is the defining characteristic of a democracy. Many more challenges face the 118th Congress. They won't be solved by the partisan divisiveness that created them. With Republicans controlling the House and Democrats controlling the Senate, we simply must embrace bipartisanship to succeed. The American people want cooperation in Washington. They want progress. Through all the noise, our citizens still hear the voices of the founders describing a republic built on a foundation of rights, responsibility, and respect. Your movement amplifies those voices. So thank you again for your commitment to this effort and for helping us get the Electoral Count Reform Act across the finish line.
So I'll share one kind of critical moment in the, it's always a long story from idea to actual law that is passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. And one of the really pivotal points in the story of the Electoral Count Reform Act was that the House and the Senate was each working on their version of it and not collaborating very well on it. We were, talking to both the House and the Senate. And they ended up coming independently to very similar legislation, kind of very similar proposals of what changes should be made. They made them in slightly different ways, but it was striking how much agreement there was. There was one kind of substantive difference that was really meaningful between them, and it had to do with, if you may recall, originally under the Electoral Count Act, it took only one senator and one representative to raise an objection to a state slate of electors. And in fact, it was Arizona's slate of electors that first got objected to. And that's what the target was on the January 6th insurrection, was to disrupt that process. And so they were using that it only took one senator and one House member to do it. So there was wide agreement in Congress among Republicans and Democrats, like, man, we do not want to go through that again. And it really, we need to raise those thresholds. That does not make sense that a single senator and a single Republican could raise an objection, because they can suggest by that there are real problems when there aren't any. So if there's a real issue, it ought to be able to attract more support than one senator and one representative. The debate was, well, how much should you raise it? The House concluded that that threshold should be raised to 1/3 of each chamber. The Senate concluded that it should be 1/4 of each chamber. We asked our members on that and a few other thresholds, and it turned out that our members preferred the Senate's somewhat lower 1/4 threshold by about 20 points, and that was true for Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. So the amount of preference for the lower threshold did not change across party. That, we came out with those results just as the debate was really heating up. The House had passed their bill. The Senate had passed their bill out of the Senate Rules Committee, but not to the floor of the House yet. We were getting near the end of the Congress. And so the question was, well, which one? We're running out of time to do the usual negotiations and reconciliation of those. Which one was it going to be? Excuse me. So we came out with those results, and Senator Collins reported to us that in the negotiations with the House, the primary piece of evidence that she used was our evidence that, well, this is what everyday Americans prefer, and that ended up being the kind of key factor that led to the Senate bill being the one that was introduced. So it was fun to hear Senator Collins tell us how she was using our work behind the scenes and how that was informing the congressional debate. We're next going to hear from Senator Michael Bennet, Democrat of Colorado. You might remember that he was a candidate for president in the Democratic primary in 2020, another centrist and moderate with whom we work closely. So we'll hear from Senator Bennet.
Hi, everybody. It's Michael Bennet. Thank you for your work to strengthen our democracy and elevate the standard of our political debate. We desperately need it. Too often the debates in Washington turn on ideology and politics when our real focus should be results for the American people. Your work to identify and advocate for important bipartisan bills has already made a difference. Last year, you helped us pass the biggest investment in American infrastructure since Eisenhower was president. Then you helped us pass the Electoral Count Reform Act, a bill that most people in America have never heard of, but is vitally important to the future of our democracy. We all saw how a few irresponsible politicians tried to exploit ambiguities in our law to undermine the peaceful transition to power, the bedrock of our democracy, of any democracy. The bill we passed with your help clarified the process and left our democracy in stronger shape for future generations. But we have a lot more work to do to build an economy that when it grows, grows for everyone, from ensuring our farmers and ranchers have enough workers to feed America, to making it easier to deploy broadband and clean energy. I deeply appreciate your work over the coming months to find the next bipartisan endeavor for Congress to take on and to accomplish. You're setting the standard for what it means to be a citizen in our democracy, and I can't thank you enough.
I got to tell you, it puts me in a good mood every time I watch those videos, and you just hear how grateful they are. You know, in some sense, we've left our members of Congress subject to those winds. You know, this is self-government after all. And so if we, the everyday Americans who are not so divided on the issues, sort of check out of politics because it feels so nasty, we're ceding the stage to the extremists. And it's hard for members of Congress to do anything but what they're doing when we've done that. And so to hear, you can just kind of hear the gratitude in their voice that everyday Americans are finally mobilizing and engaging on issues and helping them pass practical solutions. The final senator that we'll hear from is Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican from Alaska. I'll admit she is one of my favorites. You know, and I'll just point out another piece about this whole problem and how we solve it that I think Senator Murkowski is an interesting case on. In our elections, we're focused on issues, but some of the problem is around the elections and who's getting elected to office. And I suspect many of you in this room are like many Americans where you feel like by the time of the general election, you have a choice between the lesser of two evils, right? And it is the primary elections, the primaries before the general, that set who the nominees are that we get to vote for. One of the problems is that our turnout in primaries is very, very low. For example, when Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had sewn up the nominations for their respective parties in 2016, less than 9% of Americans had weighed in. So you'll often get less than 25% of Americans weighing in a primary. If it's a caucus, it's much less than that. And so that's part of what's going on with the Congress becoming more polarized. Senator Murkowski has been fearless in the wake of all that. But just this last session, this last election, Alaska implemented a new primary form where it is a nonpartisan primary at the beginning. So Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everybody's in the same primary. And the top 4 vote getters advance to the general election regardless of what their party is. So you can have multiple Republicans or multiple Democrats. And then in the general election, they have what's called ranked choice voting, where you vote your first preference, your second, your third, and then as they tally the first preference votes like you normally would. If nobody gets to 50%, then they eliminate the lowest vote getter, and they distribute for those voters, well, what was your second choice? And they distribute those, and they keep going till they get a winner. So this is a way of making sure we get the most representative politicians, not the most polarized. So there's a bit of a reason, I think, that Lisa Murkowski now, this is brand new, feels emboldened to operate on behalf of the entire American people and not just the base of her party. So we'll go ahead and listen to Senator Murkowski.
Hello, and know that I appreciate the good work of Commonsense American to address important issues facing our nation, and doing so through bipartisanship and collaboration. As those of you with CSA are well aware, the last Congress was a productive one. We came together to pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is generational legislation that provides historic funding for everything from transportation systems to broadband access, clean drinking water, and so much more. I appreciated CSA's positive engagement with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and the administration as we sought to pass that infrastructure bill. You shared your diverse experience, knowledge, and policy perspectives, and that was just what we needed to help put this legislation together and get it across the finish line. After more than a year of work, we also passed necessary reforms to both the Electoral Count Act and the Presidential Transition Act. Though not every idea was included in our final legislation, this product was again the result of bipartisan input and negotiation at its best. The information CSA provided here was really an integral part of the debate, so thank you for that. There are many challenges in front of us in the 118th Congress, and I look forward to working with you to identify and advance solutions for the American people. Really, to put it bluntly, we need your help. So get ready to take on more key issues as we together seek a better discourse and a brighter future for our nation. Thanks so much.
So that's the story of how we have looked at the formal research on what ails our politics today, looked for insights into what we might do practically to improve it, and the remarkable success we've had over just 4 years in actually bringing common sense to Washington so we are more capable of passing solutions wise enough to attract broad support. So I want to just wrap up with a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of back and forth, questions you have about how we've done it, ideas that you have, and then I'll have just a couple of minutes of wrap up. But let's have a little bit of discussion here at the end.
Hi, I have hear me talk a lot, I have a question. So that ranked choice voting that you described, what do you think, one, do you think it's an answer? And two, what do you think would have to happen policy or kind of society-wise to make that a more known thing across the nation?
Yeah, great question. So one of the challenges in making this all work is that this is a matter of state law, right? So it's a 50-state battlegrounds to do this. And none of these kinds of primary reforms have ever passed through the state legislature. They have all been through voter initiative or referendum that they've happened. It's the one thing that the incumbent Republicans and Democrats can agree on is they don't want to change the rules that got them in there, right? So it makes it hard to do it that way. So it's a state-by-state strategy. The research on what difference do those reforms make is not conclusive yet. We haven't done enough of them. And you basically have, I think, two different ideas that are each promising that have been tried. One is this nonpartisan open primary where everybody's in the same. Washington, Oregon, and Louisiana have that. And then you have the ranked choice. The state of Maine has that. Alaska is the first to put those together, just in this last 2022 election. So we don't have sufficient evidence yet to say concretely, but I've actually done some of the original research looking at that, and I'm quite pleased. I think it has had a bigger impact over one cycle or two cycles than you would expect. So I think if you were to rank order sort of the levers that we can pull that realistically could make a difference, I think it's got to be near the top of the list doing those. And I do think the combination of the two that Alaska has done is the most promising. There's, lots of particulars there that we ought to still experiment with. I'd like to see somebody try a top 2 so that they do ranked choice voting in the nonpartisan primary and then have just the 2 that come out from that in the general election. I think that would be interesting just to try. But I think that experimenting with that is going to be important, and it's going to have to, again, be citizen-led, which has been the case in all of these. So there's a couple of organizations, Represent Us and Fair Vote, or some of the organizations engaging everyday Americans to make those changes happen. And they have almost never failed when a state has gotten serious, an organization has gotten serious in a particular state about doing it. If they get it on the ballot, they almost always succeed. So I think there's quite a bit of promise there.
Hi, so thank you for your talk and this work you all are doing. So something that I'm curious about is the back-end operational side of how you execute this work. And so kind of 2 questions to that. Do you all technically work with your Civic Engagement Center on something like this? And how do you engage students at the University of Arizona in this work?
Yeah, great question. So as Betsy indicated, we're the only unit of the University of Arizona that is based in Washington, D.C. So we're actually there at the new University of Arizona D.C. Center. And so, the University of Arizona named it the National Institute for Civil Discourse. So we try to take that name seriously. In terms of, how we do the back-end engagement, the short answer is it about kills us. It's a lot of work, for the staff and the budget that we have. And so we are trying to move to a model that it is very much even more a citizen-driven organization than it is now. And so that more and more of that work is done not by the paid staff, but by the members of the organization. I'll give you a couple of examples of directions we're going there, and then a place where we're going to pilot it, particularly in Arizona, on this. This year, part of the key to mobilizing everyday, you can look at those slides and say, well, everyday Americans aren't as polarized on the issues, and so you just mobilize everyday Americans around this. Well, that's not that easy to do. Everyday Americans aren't that interested in really doing something that's really hard and involved. So we were looking for a low barrier, high hope way to get involved. So you just commit 1 hour per year to reviewing your brief and weighing in, and you get to review the brief at a time and place that's convenient to you. The brief will be up for several months, and so you can do that. So we were really careful about that, been far more successful in recruiting members than we thought, and maybe not surprisingly, especially as we've gotten success, members have now started to say, well, we'd like to do more. Not all of them, but some of them, and so we certainly want to give them a chance to do that. So this year, for the first time, we had what are called CSA convos. So as soon as you finish your brief, you can sign up for a video conference with a small group of Commonsense Americans, but politically diverse. So you finish your brief, and then you discuss that issue, and we've trained members to facilitate those, and we have a kind of structured discussion, and they absolutely love doing that. That was so successful, and it was so inspiring to us to watch these, that we started incorporating people who had participated in those CSA convos in our congressional briefing. So, we're going through the numbers and the findings that we have, and then we say, and here's so-and-so who was part of one of these conversations, and they can give the color to it. So it really packed much more of a punch that way. So we are now looking to organize members by state so that they can convene with each other more and have, for example, meetings with the congressional delegation of that state back in the state with them and do things along those lines, and looking to have members be the ones that really try to organize that. Now, since we're a unit of the University of Arizona, and we've got good membership there, that's one of the places where we'll organize first to try to do that. And we got a couple of different ideas. We're going to probably try it a little differently in different states, but Arizona will be one of our leading ones. And so you might talk to me afterwards if you're willing to roll up your sleeves on that, because we'd welcome the help. Did that answer your question? Good. So we got time for maybe one or two more questions here.
You mentioned like with ranked choice voting, there are tons of issues that like Americans think are very important, but it kind of shakes up the bureaucracy and maybe the legislators don't want to do anything about it.
Right.
What's like y'all's strategy for going after those things that Americans do care about, but politicians might not want to address?
Right. So I want to just test. I think you're being a little bit polite and civil in how you pose that question, and I just want to test if I think what you may have in mind of like, okay, we've taken on surprise medical billing and infrastructure and the Electoral Count Act, but how about some of these polarizing issues? What we do about gun violence, what we do about immigration, what we do about abortion. Is that part of, let me just see if that's...
I was thinking stuff like the fact that Congress people trade and have insane stock returns on their stock investments, things like, a lot of Americans are against, certain corporate lobbies and things like that, but obviously that's the corporate lobbyists preventing Congress from changing that. So it's more on the side of like a more like bureaucratic side, less than hot button issues.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that clarification. I will tell you that we have another basket that we work on in a side of kind of traditional policy issues, democratic reform issues, and we did one. There was a select committee on modernization of the Congress, which looked at these kinds of reforms, but they operated on a pure consensus basis. Now, it was a very impressive committee. They really operated in a very bipartisan way, but a little bit conservative in the sense that they weren't going to take on things they couldn't kind of fairly readily get consensus on. So they'd done a host of work that was widely supported by our members, and most of which has been implemented. They did not take on some of the tougher ones like you talked about. My hope is, just 3 years into engaging with Congress, with our reputation building rapidly, our membership growing rapidly, that we'll get to a place that we've got a little more oomph to be able to do that. Those kinds of reforms that you're talking about, as opposed to the primary reforms, really are federal legislation, and so are a little tougher nut to crack in that sense. But I think we're probably the best bet in the country for trying to take those on. So we certainly keep our eye on those, and I'm kind of hopeful that down the road we might get to some of those. I agree with you that there are some important ones in there to do. Good. Well, one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah, what's the issue this year, was this question. So we're in the midst of that process right now. We've conducted, I think, 25 congressional meetings so far. We've met with the White House, and we asked them, what do you see as the most promising, meaningful issues ripe for bipartisan action in 2023? With a Republican-controlled House and a Democratic-controlled Senate, it's no easy feat. So we create a top 10 list of issues from those meetings, and then we put that out to our members, and our members rate those issues, and we pick the one that our members rate most highly. So I don't know yet on 2023. I'll give you a flavor for some of the ones that are up there. Surprisingly, immigration reform is up there a bit. There's there's a lot of pieces where there's wide disagreement between the parties there, but there's a core set of kind of obvious practical solutions that are increasingly, I'm not convinced yet it can be done this Congress, but I'm becoming a little bit more optimistic. Another one is kind of tech privacy, how big tech treats your data, whether big tech should be able to get as big as they are. Should they be able to make money off a model that succeeds in making money by stirring up the pot? And there's some things that can be done there. Particularly looking at the effect of social media on youth, especially young women. So there's some interesting pieces there. I'm trying to think of a few other permitting reform. I'm missing another big one or two, but that's the flavor of the ones that we're looking at. If we take on immigration reform, that'll be the toughest one we've taken on. So let me draw us to a conclusion here. You know, I'm a believer that it is a real blessing to be born into this country in what is, without question, the most successful republic in the history of the world. None of us did anything to deserve that. We got born into it, or we moved into this country and are beneficiaries of it. But for each generation falls the responsibility of taking care of this system of self-government and passing it on to the next generation in as good a shape or better than we found it. That research that I shared with you shows that on the issue of managing our differences, our generation's record is the worst record in American history. This is the point that the Founding Fathers thought most likely to take us down, if anything would be internal political divisions. So on the point that the Founders thought most important, our generation has the worst record. I don't know about you, but I'm not okay with that. I think each of us have to kind of get a visceral level of commitment to say we are going to do our part to hand this remarkable system of self-government onto the next generation in better shape than we found it. I hope that this has convinced you that there's more that can get done, that we can have more success than you might think, and that one of the ways of doing that is that you join with us at Commonsense American. And so there's a lot of ways of getting involved in non-primary reform, but among them, I hope that you'll go to our website, commonsenseamerican.org, sign up and become a member. We've got little cards here at the end, and we'll have people passing those out that's got the URL so you can join. But I got to tell you, it will put you in a much better mood about our politics if you're involved with us and you're seeing the success that we can have. Thank you. It's been great to be with you.